Welcome to the On Purpose and For a Purpose podcast. I'm Savannah.
And I'm Claire. Our mission is to support women in discovering their purpose in everyday moments.
And each Monday, we promise to walk alongside you as you seek and understand God's Word with confidence.
So wherever and however you listen, we hope you leave inspired and empowered, knowing that you were created on purpose and for a purpose.
Hey, Claire.
Hey, Sav.
How are you?
Good. It's good to see you.
I know. I'm so happy to be back for season 3. I feel like it's been a minute since we've done this.
Yeah, it's finally September, and this is wild.
I know. Okay, so catch me up on your summer. What have you been up to?
Well, I did get to see you over the summer, so that was fun.
I know, that was the best.
So I got to see you and your fam, and then I guess as far as like stuff that we did, I went to North Carolina with my parents for a little bit and did some hiking, so that was fun.
So fun.
And we went to we were in Asheville, North Carolina, and we went to this cool pinball machine place. It was like a museum. They had all these like old timey games. So that was super fun. We were in there for a little bit too long, but
so you got to play? Like you got to play them?
Yeah.
That is
so there's
so
like
much
one
fun.
room that has pinball machines. There's another room that has like arcade games, like Galaga and Dig Dug and all those fun things.
Yeah.
So it was just really fun.
That is so good. I'm glad you got that good time with your family.
Yeah, it was a really good time. How was your summer?
It was good. It wasn't what I expected, but it was good. We got a lot of really good family time, like just the 3 of us at home, but also with like, you know, my parents, my sister and brother-in-law. So it was a sweet summer, bittersweet in some ways, but it was good. We just chilled. You know, we just enjoyed having a slower pace, which is always very well appreciated. And now that we are in the fall, even though it still feels hot as heck outside, we're in the fall. And so all the schedules are picking back up. And so I'm really appreciating how slow it really was this summer.
Yeah, it's kind of nice to get back into a groove, but then it's also like, oh, we miss it.
Yeah, it's like we're getting back into a groove, but then you're like, wait, hold on, that's too much. too much
at once. Yeah. We don't need the roller coaster.
Too much groove is happening. Yes. Okay, so we're going to do a series on Ruth. Are you excited?
Yes, I am.
I'm stoked. So I don't actually remember the last time I in-depth studied Ruth. I guess the last time I read it was when I did the Bible recap. So, you know, it's been a little while, but I'm really looking forward to this series where we can just camp out in Ruth for a few weeks and take it in like small chunks and just read through it slowly and intentionally. I think it's going to be really good for us and hopefully really good for those of you listening too. So as always, we encourage you to read along with us. We don't just want this to be something that we do on our own. We want you to open your Bible too and, you know, dig into the truth that you'll find for yourself there that could be different from what we talk about here.
Yeah, I feel like Ruth 2 is a really good book to just kind of dive into at a slower pace, because I feel like, I guess the past time I read it was when I was going through the chronological study, and I think the way that the plan was it really just had you read Ruth 1 through 4 all in like one day.
Yeah.
And not that I've read it and studied it before, but I think it was like super helpful this time to just be able to like walk through it kind of slowly and like ease into it instead of trying to just soak everything in at once. Cause I think there's so many different things that you miss. So I am excited to kind of dive into it a little bit deeper and learn more about like the historical context and also just how this book really ties into the whole redemption story of the gospel and the Bible.
Yes, I have been very surprised this time at just how much I did miss the first time or the first few times, really up until now, how much stuff I have missed and how many deeper themes there are from Genesis to Revelation, literally, where Ruth is connected to so many different themes throughout the Bible and actually really, really communicates a huge theme of Scripture that we'll get to dive in more as we go through the series. But let's get started.
today we're going to start in Ruth chapter 1. And just to kind of give you guys some context of where this book picks up, we learn a lot about this family that is originally from the land of Judah, which is in Bethlehem. And so they are Elimelech and his wife Naomi, and then they have two sons, Malon and Chilion. And during this time, there's a famine currently going on in Judah. So the family travels to Moab, and they begin to live there. And while they're living there, Elimelech eventually passes away, and his sons marry two women from Moab. So those women are Ruth and Orpah, which Ruth, in case you didn't know, is what our book is. So very important context. So at this time, both of the sons, they get married, and then eventually the sons pass away. And they basically live in Moab for about 10 years. And so kind of after all this occurs, then we pick up into verse 6, which starts talking about kind of Naomi's plan of after she's lost her husband, she's lost her two sons, she still has her daughters-in-laws, but where is she taking the story? So now we're going to start in verse 6, where it's kind of going into what Naomi's next steps are. So it says, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me.' Verse 9, "The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them and lifted up their voices and wept." So after we read those verses, we kind of see Naomi's plan as she's wanting to leave Moab and she's wanting to return back to her home. And at first she goes with, she takes Ruth and Orpah with her. And then kind of we see throughout verses 8 and 9 where she decides she doesn't want them to go with her anymore. She wants them to actually stay in their land, in their home that they're used to. And I remember when I was reading this and studying it, I was kind of confused of the significance of why she wanted them to go with her in the first place, if she was just going to change her mind. And I was kind of like interested to know just like what her motivation was with, having them go with her and then why she changed her mind. And I was just wondering, Sav, like what you kind of thought about that.
Yes, I've always been really, really intrigued by this too, because at first reading it, I'm like, that's a little harsh, Naomi, to just like, right? Hey, come with me. Like, we've just been through this huge thing together that I know that because remember, this land that they're in, Moab, why is the reason, yes, she just experienced her husband passing and her son's passing, but also they are still in a famine, right? So like, there's no food. So she hears that the Lord has provided food in her hometown, which is Judah and Bethlehem, or Bethlehem in Judah. So that's where she's wanting to go. That's where the Lord's provided. That's where she wants to go. And so she's taking her daughter-in-laws with her. But then she has this moment where she's like, wait, actually, no, I want you to stay. I want you to go back to your mother's house. That's what we read in verse 8. And I remember reading that and being like, Naomi, why in the world are we changing our mind? Like, do you not want them to go where the food is? Do you not want them to go where the Lord has provided? You're telling them to stay here in this land where this famine is. But no, Claire mentioned it earlier. This is where Ruth and Orpah are from. Like, this is their hometown. This is their homeland. This is where they are familiar. And Naomi realizes that all three of them are extremely vulnerable. They're all widows. They have all just lost their husbands. And Naomi, even more so, she's lost her sons as well. So, that's who would provide for her is her sons, but she has also lost her sons. And she knows that she's old in age. So here's Ruth and Orpah. And they're young enough where they can remarry. They can continue. They can still have provision in this land, just not through Naomi and her family. So this is really Naomi's attempt to free Ruth and Orpah from their obligation to her through marriage. She's saying, no, I want you to come with me, but more than that, I want you to be provided for and taken care of. And she believes that would be better for them if they stayed with their own family and sought out a new marriage and a new family connection. So it's really sweet of Naomi. It's incredibly selfless of Naomi too, because she's giving up her sense of provision by releasing them of this obligation. So, our initial human brains, when we read this, we tend to go, wow, that's a little harsh. That's a little dramatic. She's literally saying, go away from me. I don't want you here. But no, when you understand that deeper context of what she's truly saying, it is a massive shift. And I have so much like appreciation is not the right word. Maybe inspiration, like admiration. I'm just in awe of like Naomi's capability to be able to have that clarity and have that selflessness in this moment of such deep grief.
Yeah, because it was a lot about she was like surrendering these physical relationships that she had and emotional relationships that she had. Because honestly, at this time, I mean, for her to tell them to go back to their homes, she was thinking she was never going to see them again, probably.
Yeah.
And that she was never really going to see what their lives were going to be like when they left. Like, it was just kind of this, like, we've been through so much, you know, grief and loss together and love together. But because out of the love that I have for you, and the best that I want for you, I want you to go back home and I want you to start a new life and have new families. Like, she's thinking, I'm going to go off, they're going to go back, and I probably won't ever see them again. I may not ever know what their lives eventually look like. But she's almost like surrendering these relationships of these, like, you know, her family and like her closeness with them. And after they've been through just so much together, she's really just like surrendering that, not only to like them having free will, but also I think she was surrendering it over to the Lord as well, of just having like faith and trust in him and his plans for them. And I just think it's just so much, you know, respect and awe, like you were saying, to just see her laying that down and being at peace with going on her own to her home.
Yeah, because it's a really big, we haven't talked about this yet, but Moab and Bethlehem are very far apart from each other. I'll have to find it and tell y'all how many miles away they are from each other, but it's crazy. Like, I remember looking that up and being like, well, okay, that's not just a little hop, skip, and jump. Like, that's like a long ways away. So anyways, that's just something to consider. This journey that she's asking them, or this journey rather, that she's trying to free them from is a massive exodus almost to a brand new town, city culture for them. But a reason why this is also significant, and Naomi says this further when they, you know, because so we haven't said this either yet. I'm sorry. Ruth and Orpah's initial reaction is like, no, like, we're going to stay with you. And we see that in verse 10. She's like, no, we insist on returning with you to your people. But then Naomi challenges this in verse 11 and 12. She kind of goes on for a little bit, probably verses 11 through 15. She continues to explain why this is so important to her. And I'm not going to read it, but there's a couple things she says. The first one being, am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Are you willing to wait until they're old enough to be married? Even if I were, like Naomi is saying, even if I were able to remarry and have children, like, are you going to wait that long for them to be old enough for you to marry? And all of that doesn't really make a ton of sense unless you understand this really big concept that's going to follow us all the way through Ruth. So we need to set it up now. But it's this concept of the husband's brother. And we see it in Deuteronomy 25, and it's verses 5 through 10. And I am going to read it. It might be, bear with me, but it's so rich. And it's, like I said, so necessary for us to understand the big themes of Ruth. So here we go. Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. When brothers live on the same property and one of them dies without a son, the wife of the dead man may not marry a stranger outside the family. Her brother-in-law is to take her as his wife, have relations with her, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law for her. The first son she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, so his name will not be blotted out from Israel. But if the man doesn't want to marry his sister-in-law, she is to go to the elders at the city gate and say, my brother-in-law refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He isn't willing to perform the duty of a brother-in-law for me. The elders of the city will summon him, speak with him, and if he persists and says, I don't want to marry her, then his sister-in-law will go up to him in the sight of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and then she will declare, this is what is done to a man who will not build up his brother's house, and his family's name in Israel will be the house of the man whose sandal was removed. That is a lot of words. It's a lot of technicalities, but I hope you see through that the severity that's there. Like the Lord, this is in Deuteronomy, so this is where the Lord is laying the groundwork of laws. This is why, he's really just giving them an explanation for this is how things will happen on my land and in my family. That's kind of what these early books of the Bible are saying. So in Deuteronomy, for God to spell this out for the people, this is how this will happen, is huge for us to understand, even though it looks different today, because it was significant then, it is significant now. And Ruth helps us understand why that is significant. So to summarize what we read, because I understand it's a lot, and I do want you to go back and read that for yourself slower. And I want you to underline anytime like brother-in-law, husband's brother, anything like that stands out, because you will see the repetitive nature of that over and over again. But there's this duty here behind the husband's brother or the brother-in-law, however that makes sense for your brain. But so in this scenario, Ruth and Orpah, both of their husbands passed. There are no more brothers. But let's say there was a third brother. That's why Naomi says, if I were to have even more sons, would they not be too young for you? So let's, say there's a third. The responsibility of this third would be to marry the sisters. I don't actually know the technicality on if it would be both of them. So let's simplify this and talk about Ruth, since she's our main character. It would be to marry Ruth, provide a family with her, and then that first son or that first child would now be the heir of the brother who passed. He would surrender the right to that firstborn, and it would go to the husband who had passed, and then that child would get the inheritance of that brother. And I know it's hard for our brains to understand, because that's not necessarily how we do things today, but it's incredibly significant, because this is how they kept track of their families. This is how they kept tribes together. And then even more so than that, how they kept inheritances in the correct place. And then even further than that, this is how us as Christians, this is so important, because we're able to clearly see and identify the lineage of our Messiah. What family did he come from? What is his family tree? It's just how we're able to keep all of that together and tidy and organized. And it was very important to God that families be kept intact. He really valued families staying together and families looking out for one another and respecting one another, because this duty of the husband's brother is not, yes, it might come across as an obligation, but it is out of love and affection and honor that is placed upon that brother to step up and fill that role. And not ever, there are, it even in those verses said, there's disgrace on you if you choose not to. And so that's a very significant thing for us to understand as we walk in through these next verses, that this is what Naomi is saying. Like, I do not have another son to provide for you. I have no one in my family who can provide for you. All I have to offer is myself. And Naomi didn't see that as something worthy for the girls. She wanted to free them of that. And then this is where we land. So now Naomi has given her big explanation for why I want you to stay in your mother's land, in your mother's household. And they're faced with the decision to make. And Orpah decides, yeah, you know what? That sounds great. I'm going to head out. I'm going to go back to my mother's house. But Ruth decides that she's going to stay with Naomi. And the verse actually says that Ruth clung to Naomi. And I think that that's just a beautiful way to explain that. That imagery is just absolutely beautiful.
Let's pick up with verse 15. So it says, and Naomi says, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything, but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more.
So what Ruth says here is so extremely important that I get so hyped thinking about it, because it's just so rich. I think I've said that word so much already, but that's the best word I have on about the book of Ruth, is that it's so rich. So I don't even know where to start, Claire, We can go through the promises that she makes, because she makes 6 promises, or we can go, let's do that. Let's do that, Claire. How does that sound? So
Sure.
She makes 6 promises to Naomi, and we're just going to walk through them very briefly. So the first one, Ruth says, I will travel with you. So that means she's saying, I'm going with you. Mm-hmm. She's going to dwell with her. Look, the she's and hers. Claire and I were just talking about this. It's difficult. When you're reading this, if you need to give Ruth a color and Naomi a color, do it, because all the pronouns, all their different names, you get a little lost. So I'm going to try that again, everyone. Ruth is going to travel with Naomi. Ruth is going to dwell with her. Ruth is going to claim Naomi's people as her own people. And Ruth says, this one's a big one. Ruth says, I will worship your God. Ruth says, I will die where you die. And then lastly, she says, I will also be buried where you are buried. And these statements show so many things. But let's start with, it shows Ruth's devotion to Naomi and her confidence that you are not going to change my mind. This is what I'm going to do. And we see that Naomi understands that, because in verse 18, it says like, Naomi, hold on, let me read it. Naomi saw that Ruth was determined and stopped talking to her. She's like, all right, this girl is clearly being stubborn. She's coming with me, even though I've made sure she understands I can't provide for her. I have nothing to offer her. And she's still coming with me. So I'm just going to stop talking to her.
Well, I think too, she just saw the vow. She was just like, I would have just been in awe. Yeah, I would have just been like, okay, we're done. Moving along.
She's like, I have nothing else to say. You know, it's kind of like Ruth's mic drop moment for sure, where she's like, have I made up your mind now that I'm coming with you and that I'm going to be devoted to you, because this is what I have resolved myself to do. But what gets me hype is, I told y'all number 4, worship your God, is important, because this is more than just a promise to Naomi. These verses, and it's just verse 16 and 17, these verses are a proclamation and confession of faith for Ruth. She's saying, your God's my God. I will worship your God. Your people will be my people. She is claiming God as her personal God, as her Lord, as her King. This is what she's saying, because in verse 17, where she says, may the Lord punish me and do so severely, she uses, or the word there is Lord, all caps, Lord, which means Yahweh and Jehovah. And we've talked about in our earlier seasons with Morgan about what that means. That's God's personal name. It's not just being reverent. It's not saying, you know, your God, your Lord. She's saying he is yours, but he's mine. I'm taking him as mine. So it's just so important, because Ruth is saying, yes, I'm all in with you, but even more, I'm all in with God. He is my God, and we're going to do this together.
Yes, and what's so significant about number 4 is that talking about worshiping Naomi's God. So from what we know about the Moabites and what Naomi has said in verse 15 about Orpah going back to her home and worshiping her gods. So Moabites worshiped an assortment of gods, little g. And that was what, you know, Ruth grew up in. And so whenever this family, you know, moves and starts living in Moab, but they're originally from Judah, you know, and then they marry Ruth and Orpah, there's probably this difference of religion going on, you know. And so I think that it's safe to assume that, you know, Ruth and Orpah were able to become aware of what, you know, maybe Elimelech and his family believed in. And so it's just really incredible to see how Ruth in this moment is also proclaiming that everything that she was raised up in and what she worshiped beforehand, before knowing these people, like, she's just throwing it out and just saying, like, no, like, I'm going to serve the real God. And she's having that faith to step into, and then following Naomi to go to her land that she's never been before probably, and doesn't know what to expect and doesn't know what's going to happen next. But she's like, as long as I'm with you and I have God, like, we're good to go. Like, I'm strapping on my sandals. We're heading out.
Yes, I think that's so beautiful. And I love what you just said, like, as long as I'm with you. I mean, that's literally when she says, where you go, I will go. Like, where you live, I will live. She just wants to be with Naomi, because to her, we've seen how, like, how did, you touched on this, like, how did Ruth learn this about God? Well, through Naomi, through watching Naomi and the way that Naomi has responded to the situation that they're in. Because we don't need to forget that, and I don't really think you can in this first chapter, that Naomi is experiencing the worst heartache. I mean, we don't know anything else about her life, but I would assume it's safe to say this is the worst heartache she has ever experienced, losing her husband and her 2 children in the span of a few years. That's really intense. And so even in the midst of what Naomi might consider her worst moment of her life, through Ruth watching how she's handled that grief, Ruth is like, I want what you have. God has spoken personally to each woman about himself through the other, which has so amazing and speaks to the importance of community and having people around you and not doing life alone. But I just think that's so beautiful that despite everything Naomi's been through, Ruth wants to be with her, is drawn to her, has learned about God through her. And that fruit was clearly so evident in Naomi's life. And then if we look at the flip side of that, what does Ruth teach Naomi? Well, Naomi sees the fruit in her life. She feels, and we'll read next week, so a smidge bit of a spoiler alert, but Naomi kind of feels like, the Lord's taken everything from me. I don't have anything else. Look at all the Lord's affliction that he's placed on me. And Ruth is able to come into this and say, no, there's so much fruit here. I see the Lord's faithfulness to you. I see your faithfulness to the Lord. I see the fruit that's in your relationship with him. And I not only see it, but I want it for myself. And I want it with you. I want us to pursue the Lord together. And I just think it's so beautiful because Naomi couldn't really feel God, but Ruth could see the evidence of God in her life, in Naomi's life. And I just think that that is such a beautiful thing, this relationship that we're able to see. And I love that it's between a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law, how they're able to come together. And, it might be like an unusual relationship to see this displayed because these verses 16 and 17 are used in weddings all the time. They're those verses that people tend to go to, but it's between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, this devotion to one another and this devotion ultimately to the Lord is so beautiful and such a sweet way to end this first episode. It sets us up for so much success for the next 3 chapters. And again, we've said it, and I will continue. There's so much richness and beauty to be found, and we're really excited because we literally just scratched the surface today.
Hey, podcast fam. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode today. I hope that it was encouraging and uplifting to your week. We just love to connect with you guys, so if you haven't already, give us a follow on Instagram at On Purpose Podcast. It is a great way for us to hear from you and for us to just share a little bit of different things around these topics and discussions to continue those conversations online. We also would love for you to leave us a review sometime if you have a chance. This is a great way for us to hear a little bit about what you think of the podcast and also any sort of topics you want us to discuss in the future. We just love being able to connect with you guys on many different platforms. So with that being said, I hope that y'all have a great rest of your week and that you'll tune in with us next Monday to learn more about how to live on purpose and for a purpose.